Welcome. For the last year, we've been doing weekly COVID reports, looking back at how everyone has been moving around the UK and really getting into the detail of what we've seen over the course of that week. What we wanted to do in this session is to take a step back from that detail and to start talk about what we've learned on, I suppose, a national level and as a business and about the consumer, because it's been a year of, it's fair to say, significant upheaval for everybody. So with me today are the authors of all the reports. You may, I hope, have noticed if you've been reading them that we rotate on a weekly basis. So there's 4 of us who've been writing them for the last 52 weeks. So it's myself, Alex. I work in the property team looking after innovation. I've also got with me Chris, who works with occupiers, retailers in MPG. Paul, who is working in the public sector and with a lot of our health clients in terms of understanding movement of people and data. And then John, who also works in the property team and has a remit around market research and understanding customers. So the aim of what we wanted to do today was, just take a step back from that detail. And I think before we dive into it, and we'll be exploring each of our sectors in more detail, is just understand the data. So when we first started doing this, I think we're still getting our heads around just how powerful a data set this is. We're getting 4 days in arrears, billions of records tracking people all across the UK in terms of understanding how crowds of people are moving and how residents of a neighbourhood are moving to other neighbourhoods and whether they're engaging with different places and different locations and so on. And I think as we explored it, it really started bringing out some really interesting things and challenging a lot of preconceptions that were in the press and informing us of things that were happening before they actually became headlines. So I'm thinking like some of the early things we were seeing where a lot of the press coverage was very negative about people breaking lockdown restrictions, and we were able to demonstrate in the data that that was born out of necessity and out of affluence rather than people not following rules. There was other things I think that we found very interesting that that I suppose lifted us out of our lockdown bubbles. So we all locked down in different circumstances, and John with a newborn, and Paul and Chris not in London, and so on. And I think when you're in lockdown, you focus on your neighbourhood and your local area. And what this data really did is it drew us out of that and made us realise what else was going on. So I suppose, what did we learn? I think at a headline view, we learned that people follow rules. As generally speaking, we locked down and we locked down hard. I think was it the first 2 weeks we went from 100% of movement, if you like, as an index down to 30% across the UK. And that's huge. That was people really changing their behaviours. We also learned that whilst people follow rules, they move to headlines and to announcements rather than policy. So whenever a relaxing of rules was flagged in a week's time, we saw that movement immediately upticked. So there was a reaction that people moved to the media, more so arguably than government policy, which I thought was really interesting. We also saw a number of big trends which emerged as we went through lockdown, which we have then seen reinforced in a lot of the consumer market research we did. So things around localism. So the fact that even when lockdown restrictions were eased, people still chose to stay local and still chose to engage with their local neighbourhood. And there was almost this rise of, you could term it community wellness, as opposed to, say, personal wellness, which is maybe where we were a little bit more selfishly before coronavirus came along. We obviously saw this big shift to work from home. I think this is the first time the 4 of us have actually all collectively been in the office together in 18 months or whatever it's been. So that has changed the way people engage with space. It's transformed cities. We'll drill into that, I'm sure. And we also saw a channel shift. So we saw in our banking data that we collect a huge shift to online spend. When we were in lockdown, obviously the stores were closed. But we've also seen a long-term shift towards people engaging more with open spaces. And I think both of those tie down to a combination of both necessity but also safety. That consumers are now putting safety first when they go into spaces, so that they value open air and they value those secure environments where they feel that there is health security, which I don't think was on anyone's agenda before coronavirus came along. So those sort of things we've seen at a national level. What I want to do in the next, the rest of the session is basically drill into each of our different sectors and some of the detail we saw and what it kind of means to our clients and what it means, I suppose, to us. So Chris, if we start with you, thinking, I suppose, about occupiers and retailers, what key things have been pulled out of the data from your clients?
It's been quite a roller coaster of questions and answers that retailers and leisure operators have been trying to take from the data, if I go back to the first few weeks, much like the many of the government briefings with the national line going down, coming back up again, down again and back up, what really became quite interesting is as soon as you start to unpick that from a demographic perspective, so trying to put the consumer lens on things, we start to see some very interesting patterns emerge. As essentially in that first lockdown, market share was set to 0, and the first questions were, where are my customers? Do I have new customers? So by using the mobility data, we can start to see, well, how are the more affluent groups responding? As you rightly mentioned, we've seen a significant increase in working from home, people shifting to digital channels. So we had grocers saying queue management, bizarrely, was something that came into our world. How are they able to manage queues in store, but also trying to understand which demographic groups potentially are staying more local and using online. As we move into the summer for various periods of easing, we had the leisure operators benefiting from the Eat Out to Help Out. So we saw many of the more affluent families coming out to spend their money. Then they don't have those expensive season tickets and to travel into work. So they had some pent-up demand to spend. And then through various points of the year when retailers were allowed to open up, so non-essential retail, again, the questions around which demographic groups were visiting those centres. So we see the less affluent groups typically moving more, which is the reverses that we'd ordinarily see in many of our predictive models. Previously, more affluent groups would be far more mobile than many of the less affluent groups. But as we could see that many of the key workers working in factories, the grocery sector and the NHS were actually moving more, which is the reverse of typically what we'd see. So this all then starts to become quite a complex set of circumstances for retailers and leisure operators. So the mobility data has been a significantly important data set to start unpicking that.
Just on that point, I think, Chris, because I don't think anyone had really clocked beforehand that key workers were sort of the mid to lower affluence groups, and the degree to which as a society we relied on those guys. Your delivery drivers, the people who work in supermarkets, the porters in hospitals, I mean, obviously the doctors and so on, but there's actually, and that, it did really come through, didn't it? Because they also are the guys who live in cities. I suppose what we're saying is, and I would throw, to an extent, the four of us into that, those affluent groups, that you could afford to stay at home, basically. You had a garden.
Yeah, so if I talk from my own perspective, having that additional space, living further out of London meant that we could stay where we were. We didn't have to move around, go visit certain parks. And even from a property perspective, which would be interesting to get John's point of view, is that the local town, so I lived in Bicester I actually moved house during the pandemic, but living in Bicester for a long period meant that we could spend time in a local town. There was plenty of restaurants and shops, but I know that over the course of the pandemic, we could see from the tracker that different retail spaces fared quite differently. Certainly as the safety became more of a concern for many of the more vulnerable groups.
I think it's fair to say that the impacts of the pandemic hasn't been felt equally across different types of locations. So talking about your local high street, if we look at the weekly trackers, it's always been the rural towns and the regional towns that have come out on top and are now kind of well above the 100% mark that they were at the start of the pandemic. If I think about my local high street where I live in Balham, having worked from home pretty much every day for the last 18 months, I've bought lunch out every day, I've bought from the local butcher, whereas before you just go to Sainsbury's on a Saturday. So it's really given people the chance to fall back in love with their local high street. The flip side to that, you've got city centres with the lack of workers going in every day, the lack of tourism. They've been hit the hardest, and their mobility is always kind of tracked bottom or near the bottom of that chart. Is that
workers that's doing that, or is it destination shopping, or is it both, do you think?
A combination of all. I think largely workers. If you think about the percentage of people across the country, at least half people are working from home almost full time now, and are spending their money that they would have spent in their workplace now where they live, or not at all. Yes, destination shopping, but regional malls we're seeing, so regional malls, retail parks, outlet centres, they do bounce back very quickly after
it's
after
fascinating,
reopening.
isn't it? That massive pent-up demand, that huge rush to the shops when people haven't been able to buy.
They've seen a real roller coaster. So the minute they open, their mobility will jump 50-60% in a week, and then kind of plateau. So over the last month or so, regional malls in particular have really plateaued at about 80%. So they shot back up to 80%, and then they kind of stayed there. People have gone back with that pent-up demand and realised that it's just a shop and they don't want to necessarily keep going up and up.
That then presents a whole load of operational issues, doesn't it? Because you touched on outlet centres there, but one of the things I always thought was quite interesting was that going into it, regional malls were held up as like these big behemoths that, was it years ago, Paul, we described them as shopping palaces or something like that.
Yeah.
These huge behemoths that everyone would go to. And then when we, obviously, their USP pre-pandemic was that they were covered and that they were enclosed, and that was a good thing. And then as we see that demand getting released, actually outlet centres have really come back up because you've got premium, you've got value for money, and it's open air. And I think that last one becomes a real important.
That and retail parks and shopping parks have seen a big resurgence in its malls now. Being all under one roof is now a hindrance rather than a help.
And then having a big grocer as an anchor also makes has a benefit, whereas previously, you would have seen these centres trying to shed some of that convenience retail in favour of destination.
A few points there which reminded me a little bit of with the surveys that we've ran in addition to the mobility trackers, understanding why we're seeing changes. So the problem sometimes with a lot of this data is that you assume that everything you see is a direct result of things that are happening right now. We know that if we go back a couple of years now, we talked about the overspacing of city centres potentially in certain parts of the country, and retail parks and leisure parks were emerging as an area that were underserved. And a lot of our clients now, particularly leisure, we're seeing they're termed leisure parks, but it's in reality a mix of retail and leisure. They've performed consistently well throughout the period we've been tracking, and we're seeing that as these places have become more convenient for people, it's not been an issue of safety. Many of our clients have seen the performance of these sites almost double overnight in terms of how they're doing previously. So that's been quite an interesting trend that has been accelerated as a result of the pandemic, and I think that's something that you have to be careful of, is that every time we see the dial go up and down, that we don't attribute that behaviour to everything that's happening as a result of the pandemic.
We're taking a very commercial view on this, and the great thing about the data is that we're not just seeing how people move to shopping centres, but we're seeing how people move everywhere, and we've got this coming in constantly. So we've got applications that are, I suppose, far beyond anything we could have conceived of, going back 18 months or so. And one of those views is how people are moving outside of those retail centres and how people are moving more generally. What are we seeing in the public sector in terms of how that's being used?
My sector is very, very wide. It covers anything from sort of pseudo-commercial through to true public. But yeah, sort of as an interesting link, Westminster City Council have been using this data very differently at two different stages of the pandemic. When restrictions were strongly in place, they were using the data at a very granular level to start to spot where there were potentially risky agglomerations of people. And they used that to pinpoint where they needed to put in restrictions, where they needed to put in signage, and where they needed to manage those movements. Then we move into a later stage of the pandemic and the restrictions are easing, and then it's about trying to boost the local economy. So Westminster City Council has some of the premium leisure retail destinations in the country. So they use the data to start to spot where people traditionally came into Westminster from, but weren't at the moment. And they used that to target specific messages to specific groups in specific locations, and used it to market the area, and saw measurable increases in movement. So that's an interesting sort of one that crosses in terms of all of our sectors. Public health is in our area, and yeah, a major public health provider in the country has been using the data weekly at a very granular level to start to be able to monitor movement levels and potentially to actually predict the possible change in the virus and where it will pop up, and also the risks of movements, because we've seen that there is this income and acorn demographic link that potentially has higher risks amongst certain groups when they move around more. So that's been a really interesting way of using it. And then utilities, another of the clients in our area. Yes, it's pretty obvious that people have been in different places during the day. I've been at home. I have been using water at home rather than water in the office. But our utilities clients have to report to their regulator around why consumption patterns are behaving in a different way. And this can give clear evidence of
It's like the half-time kettle on a massive scale for 18 months.
That's exactly right. And yeah, I've seen some fascinating stuff in the water sector that is seen from their data of changes in the pre-work shower peaks and stuff like that, but actually different demographic groups use different volumes of water. So if we can say, well, during this period of the pandemic, there were a lot of Acorn A's in this area that would usually have been at their place of work, that is useful for evidencing why the demand is as it is.
That forecasting piece and that modelling piece, because I mentioned it at the beginning, but we're now in the realms of billions, aren't we, in terms of volume of data that's coming in, like every week just coming in. And I know there's been, we've been talking as a business around what we can do with this in terms of machine learning and predictive algorithms, and modelling and all the rest of it. Do you see that as something long-term that then develops into provision of services across the public sector? So not necessarily tying into any specific cases as you mentioned, but just as a general sort of how data can be better used in the future?
Yeah, ultimately this is like a massive market research piece. Yes, it doesn't ask people the why, but it's huge volumes of data that by linking it to Acorn, we know who they are, where they are, and what they're doing. So the way that we can slice it to answer different questions is massive. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's not based on people's reporting.
Yeah.
So we've talked about in our space about we use the data in the context of, say, taking an estate where you might have a number of different things going on. So it could be like a Broadgate in the City of London, or Wembley Park, or Cadogan's estate in Sloane Square, taking a sort of a big area like that, and actually using that data to understand how people engage with it and moving it. And the traditional challenge around asking people why is always getting a big enough sample, but this actually gives you time of day stuff. But then actually we started saying, well, you could use the historic data to start predict future events. So should, if not coronavirus, something else come along, you could actually start predicting, well, what's the response going to be to
and
that?
even just at a national level, we pretty well nailed, if you tracked our commentary through the weeks as we were coming out of that last lockdown, the third lockdown, let's hope it's the last lockdown, we said, we reckon by the end of May we will be pretty well at 99%. I think we were pretty well bang on. That's at a national level. There's so much going on at a more local level that, could again be modelled. But we all hope that there isn't another pandemic, but we have seen some trends. We can now start to see and predict what we expect to see.
Where do we think the vaccine rollout is coming? Are we seeing that coming through in the data? Are we seeing people actually becoming more comfortable with the data? Are there certain groups which are responding better to those public health provisions? Can we see that coming through?
We certainly saw, as the vaccine started to roll through the age groups, that the more affluent and the older groups started to move again for the first time. Interestingly, for the last 3 weeks, we've seen a flick back to affluence driving things. All 5 of the most affluent groups are now moving less than average. The 6 least affluent are moving more than average. So I think we do have this thing of, as I think you said in the introduction, when a change happens, the affluent suddenly go out. If they're allowed to go out again, they will. There's that pent-up demand that they use. But the minute things get risky, they're the ones who can lock down. So I think we are seeing that, even though the vaccine has rolled out, people are still a little bit nervous. So they have the more affluent have locked down, and we're seeing that, we are seeing this disproportionately higher levels of movement of the less affluent groups again.
So I suppose, if we are looking forward to the future and trying to, let's be optimistic here, let's assume the vaccine uptake has been very strong so far, let's assume that continues, and we are seeing a removal of restrictions as forecast at the moment in July. Is there anything you think, and Chris, maybe this one for you, or John, is there anything you think we can learn from what we saw last summer when it was Eat Out to Help Out and we had that removal of restrictions, and there was a general sort of, I don't want to overstate a euphoria or a flooding back, but there was an absolute uptick we saw. Do you think there's anything that was worth drawing on that experience in this summer?
I think, so Paul and I were talking before about the success of the Eat Out to Help Out, and we were actually saying that we think it was consumers that were driving that anyway. We don't necessarily think that Eat Out to Help Out was the reason that was pushing people out there. I think people, when they feel safe, and certainly the summer has a different feel. So I would expect the travel restrictions that will probably continue to some degree for a period of time will shift out the British summer holiday into September, October probably. So I'd imagine we'll see that demand that we've talked about for a while start to come through, and we're already exceeding that 100% mark. I think what will be interesting is, just thinking about some of our clients from more convenience side of things, is the missions that start to play out in certain areas. Will people are asking the question, how will the cities fare? I think they will creep back to levels that we higher than what we saw last summer, but where that will quite settle down, I'm not sure. But as workers, tourists, the transient groups come back, that's where again this data will be quite helpful to unpick the various missions in different places, or when are people visiting, why, that sort of thing.
I mean, because transport hubs have stayed resolutely at
Exactly,
25%,
yeah.
haven't they? There's nothing that's moving that dial at the moment.
I'm having conversations with people who are doing research into the transport market, and yet there are very distinct, different responses to willingness to go on trains. Yeah. I don't know how we've all got in today. I went on an overland train because it was relatively spacious and safe. Would I go on the tube? I'm less sure. And yeah, again, this is both regionally skewed and demographically skewed. So I think urban areas that are heavily reliant on crowded routes could still see a suppression in their movement for some considerable time.
Can we come back to the region in a second? Because I wanted to just ask John specifically, because thinking about our sector and property, going into the pandemic, probably one hot sector as it was transport hubs. You know, everyone was talking about this is the future, it's about connecting people whilst they're moving, it's convenience, fashion and all the rest of it. And obviously, as we've just described, that has fallen away quite substantially. Where does that then leave, I suppose, city centres? If let's assume everyone's double vaxxed and it's happily in the rearview mirror, I think it's fair to say we're all going to keep working from home. What does that do to cities?
From a employee point of view, you want to work from home, but whether the employers, when the government restrictions lift and people are allowed to go back full time, whether all the employers are going to let people work from home, I think is another question. But let's assume most organisations end up with some sort of hybrid model where you're probably in part-time, at home part-time. Obviously the footfall going into cities is going to remain low, the footfall on public transport will remain low, the new part-time season tickets they bought in will allow people to commute at a cheaper cost. But just because footfall's down, I don't think necessarily means spend is going to go down at the same level in cities. I think I used to go to Tesco, have my lunch every day and spend probably 30 quid a week in my place of work. If I'm in 2 days a week, I'll probably go out for lunch those 2 days, end up probably spending more because you want to be more sociable, go for lunch with your colleagues. So I think footfall might change permanently, but I don't think the impact will be seen as significantly on the spend from a worker point of view.
And then there's a correlation to that, which is if the spend is coming down in the cities, it's almost like whack-a-mole, isn't it? You push it down here, it's going to pop back up somewhere else. So if you're at home 3 days a week, then actually all of a sudden you start seeing a return of little independent coffee shops,
exactly.
High streets, and I mean, this is anecdotal, but in the first stages of one of the lockdowns, I was talking to the greengrocer on our high street, and they were saying like they had people coming in who they hadn't seen, and they'd lived in the area for 5 years, but because these people were going to work 5 days a week, they were leaving home at 7, and everything was closed, and they were coming back at 7, and everything was closed. And then at the weekend, they were getting out of their local neighbourhood. And so they literally had never engaged with the shops that were on their doorstep, or never knowingly had done so.
We talked about during the pandemic, the more affluent people saving money because they didn't have the option to spend, so they actually come out of this more affluent than they were, whereas some people have lost their jobs and have got less income. Once things open up again and people have the ability to spend, people will spend. So to your whack-a-mole point, if people aren't spending at their place of work, then they inevitably will spend where they live. They're not just going to not spend any money when they have the option to. So I think there's a finite amount of money that's not going to change. It's just going to get redistributed probably from the city centres to the more of the suburban rural towns.
One thing which we didn't get to, and I'm interested if Westminster looked at this, but was the frequency of visits. We've saw the success and failure of some of the asset classes over the periods, but if people, what we're seeing through some of the surveys, that people are keen to travel, but they may travel less and spend more. Do you see any particular types of locations that will benefit from that, whether it's cities or more out-of-town destinations? So people don't visit as often, but when they do, they're spending more of their leisure, their retail time in these places.
Anecdotally, that is kind of what we're hearing, is that you're getting more engaged trips, that when people undertake that trip, they are more engaged. And we sort of touched on it with our office point, like the idea that you're going into the office because it's a collegiate space and you want to work with colleagues, and that then means that you're more inclined to make the time to go out and have lunch with them, and that you've left the house for the day, so you're more inclined to stop at the shops on your way home and not rush home because you always get the 6:14 train out of Victoria. There's a little bit more flexibility that comes into that. So I do think, to John's exact point, that you will see an absolute shift in footfall, but actually not necessarily to the same extent in terms of spend, and you might see a distribution of spend at the expense of Pret, and not just Pret, but grab and go sandwiches. You know, that people won't be shoveling food into their mouth over their computer. They'll be a bit more engaged, but that actually creates an opportunity, as Pret have talked about, in the local areas where people are during the day. We have seen variation in regions, and quite notable variation. I don't know, Paul, if you want to touch and drill into that in a little bit of detail in terms of just what we have seen, and then we can maybe start exploring why.
Yeah, well, the obvious differences in the dashboard that we've been reporting on, have done at region and nation level, and you absolutely see changes in movement that track government policies. And again, that does back up some of what you said right in the introduction, that people have generally followed rules.
So the home nations?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that. And yeah, we have seen when there have been regional lockdowns, we have again seen significant shifts in all of that. Now, sort of starting to crystal ball gaze into the future, and will populations fundamentally shift? Some of that's linked to the point that you were raising, John, around will we be able to carry on working at home as people think they are? But there has been some evidence in the data that we have been seeing that more people have moved house who live in London, which backs up some of the headlines. It's not the exodus that I think some headlines would lead you to believe, that a lot of people have stayed in the same area. There is some evidence that it is the younger urbanites who are moving most, and they're moving out. We've seen evidence of slight increases in movement activity into the southwest and southeast. So yeah, will that fundamentally change regional populations? Will be really interesting.
I think we first said it 2 weeks into the pandemic, this idea that it's accelerated consumer behaviour 5 years in the first month of April 2020. Do you think that shift we've seen in terms of house movers and urbanites moving out of London, is that people who would have moved anyway and they've done it 3 years earlier than they were going to?
Communities could fundamentally change if these are new patterns, or it could just be things settle back to normal and we go, yeah, they just moved 2 years earlier and they've moved to the house that they planned to move to when they were going to have their children, and things don't fundamentally change. But yeah, will that have actually been also sped up by the stamp duty holidays, and now that those are going, will things settle back? It's definitely we want to track, because from either side of the work that we do, businesses, commercial organisations are going to want to be making sure they're targeting the areas with these new consumer groups, but from a local authority and planning and public health, you've got to understand who is there to actually serve them.
I think a lot of the movement may well be temporary as well. So if you think about our team is relatively young, and a lot of them live in house shares. When they were working from home, there was 3-4 people in one space, and a lot of them chose to go and temporarily live back with their parents where they had their own room to work in. I think, again, when we're back at work and that isn't the norm, you might well see more of a return to previous habits.
But on that, and I suppose one of the things I think it's fascinating with me, and maybe it's because I'm in that group, but we've seen London consistently, where you'd almost argue that it was probably one of the most mobile regions, or at least, to stereotype slightly, the busiest region in terms of people, travelling to work and commuting, and everyone talks about that. Throughout the pandemic, it has consistently been the least mobile of the regions.
Access to services drove a big part of that. So certainly initially when it was about access to essential retail, so food in particular, living in a rural North Yorkshire now, we have to travel significantly further, and it's almost like you've got lots of groups of people coming to the same place, and we were sort of hypothesising whether that was contributing to a faster spread of infections in those areas, whereas London, you're able to stay still and have access to services.
There was 4 weeks,
doorstep.
there was 5 weeks where I didn't actually leave our road. because there was shops either on it or so on, because to that exact point, there was no need. As you're looking forward again to sort of this Great British Summer that's due to start anytime soon, we have seen during half term, I think it was, we saw a couple of the regions spike up in terms of mobility, and from memory it was the southwest, the northeast, and basically anywhere with sort of go-to coasts. Do you think that's here to stay? Do you think we're going to have that, people have sort of rediscovered Britain, or do you think actually the first time we're allowed to travel properly, we're just going to revert back to what we were doing? Where is tourism in the next 3 years?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element with all of this of people have realised what's on their doorstep a bit more. As a family, we kind of forced to spend more time with each other, and you kind of looking at what beyond that walk around the park that everybody did probably for the first few months. There's certainly a lot more on the doorsteps. I think people have become to realise what's out there, and it's interesting. A lot of the affluent groups were moving out on holiday to the Lake District and places like that, and having spent some time there last summer, and again in coming months, I'd expect to see high levels of visitation again. Clearly, when restrictions open up around travel, people will be quite desperate to get back out there. But I think it's probably been pretty good for tourist destinations in the UK in terms of visitation, certainly.
To wrap up, I'm going to, unfairly, because I haven't pre-warned you on this at all, ask each of you to predict for your sector where you think it's going to be in 2 or 3 years, and not necessarily about what the future is, but almost how has it changed as a result of the pandemic, and from what we've seen in the evidence, where do you think we're going to be in 2 or 3 years? So once we're past the immediate disruption and we've reverted to whatever this new reality is, what does that look like?
If I think about the sort of questions we're being asked now from many of the retailers and leisure operators that are looking at a 3-year strategy, everything's looking at their estate through a digital lens. So what that means is that they're looking at their estate and thinking, well, this was a store estate or bars and restaurants that was serving a very different market going back over a year ago, and they're looking at them now and saying, well, as we see these trends emerge, and some will persist and some won't, how well placed are we to serve that new market? So the data's been helping with that. The reality is that the digital element, I think, is something that will stick around. You mentioned the jump forward in 5 years point. So I would expect in 3 years there'll be many retailers and leisure operators looking at the value of their physical touch points to say how much is this contributing beyond just the sales through the till. So it might have been previously they needed 100 stores to serve the market. In 3 years it would be potentially more like 75, 60, certainly less than what they had, but each of those stores will be contributing to digital sales, brand awareness and other things. I think retailers and leisure operators, and that includes delivery as well and groceries online, looking at their estate from more of a digital perspective. And then the same questions persist. Who are my customers? Where are they coming from? What sort of mission should I serve? So that will stay, but in reality, because consumer behaviour has changed and will continue to, they'll have to make sure that their physical estates align to these new behaviours.
We're already seeing changes in the dynamic between sort of state and private operators. I think that is going to change. Local populations look like they are changing. Their needs are likely to change in the future. Really, it's just essential that as we look forward and continue to see these changes, that we monitor data. This movement of people data might be one of those, but yeah, we also need to combine it with findings from the new census and also surveys of actually what do people want and why are they making these changes. And only then will we be able to provide the services that the local people need.
I think it's also a hard question to answer from a property point of view. We've talked a lot already about quite general the asset types, a city centre versus a mall versus an outlet. And I think we can't answer it at that general level. I think even within asset types there's such variation. If you look at Liverpool versus Manchester at the moment, Liverpool's at 75% mobility, Manchester's at 35%, Bluewater's at 60%, Westwood Stratford's at 40%. They're same asset types, but it's all about the consumers and how people are interacting with them. So I think to really understand how it's going to impact property, you need to really understand who the consumer is, how they're interacting with you, and to do that, it's data. It's using the mobile data we're talking about, but marrying that with other data sets like banking data to understand how much people are spending, market research data to understand the why.
So I suppose to summarise, what I'm hearing across from all of you is effectively data. It is about using these assets that we have in our hands now, which if you went back 2 years, they were very nascent and you couldn't really draw deep insight from them. We're in a world now where we have all of these data points coming in, we have banking data, we've got consumer research data, we've got market research data, we've got focus groups. And it's listening to people, understanding consumers and understanding how they interact with place. I think whether it's occupiers, owners or the commercial sector, the fundamentals of understanding what people do remain the case. I think that's probably been what we've been trying to do for the last year each week, is understanding what people do and understanding how they engage with space. Thank you to my panelists and fellow authors. Thank you for watching, and thank you for hopefully reading all of the reports we've written over the last 52 weeks. The reports may be coming to an end now as we move out of the final stages of restriction, but I think it is worth stressing that the data that's gone into it and the work that we do continues, and we are open for contact if you want to get in touch, if there's anything that you want to discuss in terms of what we've touched on today or that's been raised in the reports. But all of that data, all of that insight, that's still happening, that's still going on in the background. So get in touch if you want to know more.